You know, the Hebrew Bible, it's not just a book. It's a foundational text for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We're talking about a story that has shaped the beliefs of billions of people and has influenced law, art, and culture for thousands of years. It's this sweeping epic of origins, Exodus, and Kings.
But that brings up a really fascinating question, right? For historians and archaeologists, the challenge is figuring out how this sacred narrative lines up with the physical evidence, the stuff we can actually dig out of the ground, and the records left behind by other ancient civilizations. So let's dive in and see where the story and the science actually meet.
So here's our game plan. We're going to journey through the biblical timeline, starting with the age of the patriarchs. Then we'll investigate the great mystery of the Exodus, watch the rise and fall of an Israelite kingdom, and finally explore what might be their most revolutionary idea of all, the belief in one single God.
Okay, so right off the bat, we have to acknowledge that there are two totally different ways of looking at this text. For millions of people, it's a divinely inspired, perfect record. For a historian, though, it's a priceless but really complex historical document, one that has to be carefully checked against any other evidence we can possibly find.
And what's so cool is that taking this critical approach doesn't actually take away from the story. In fact, as our source material puts it, the history that starts to emerge is unique, it's complex, and honestly, it might be even more interesting than the story we thought we knew.
So let's start where the Hebrew story really begins to take shape, with these foundational figures called the patriarchs, the founding fathers of the ancient Israelite families. And it all kicks off with a man named Abraham.
So the biblical timeline tells us that around 2150 BCE, Abraham gets this divine call. He packs up and travels from this huge Mesopotamian city all the way to a new land called Canaan, supposedly laying the groundwork for a brand new nation.
But here's where we hit our first major roadblock. There are just no archaeological sites, no records from that time that mention a person named Abraham. And the written stories we have about him, they were put to paper more than 1,000 years after he supposedly lived. Just think about that gap for a second. It's possible he was a real person and his story was just passed down orally for centuries. But with a gap that huge, history just can't verify it.
The patriarchal story keeps going, of course, with Abraham's descendants, and it all leads to his great-grandson Joseph. The Bible says Joseph's family ends up settling in Egypt around 1800 BC, and that sets the stage for one of the most famous stories ever told.
And this brings us right to the story of Moses. According to the Bible, things go south for Joseph's descendants in Egypt. Their fortunes turn, and they eventually become enslaved, suffering under this cruel but interestingly unnamed Pharaoh.
Out of this oppression rises a hero, Moses, who goes to the Pharaoh and demands freedom for his people. After a whole series of divine plagues, the Pharaoh finally gives in, and the Hebrews begin this massive migration, the Exodus, out of Egypt, across the Sinai Desert with the goal of conquering the land of Canaan.
Okay, so here, the historical picture is incredibly blurry. On one hand, you've got these little clues that make you go, For instance, the name Moses is actually Egyptian, not Hebrew. And the story names specific midwives, a tiny detail that kind of suggests a real remembered tradition. But on the other hand, the all-powerful Pharaoh is never named, and years of digging at places like Jericho show no signs of the kind of massive, fiery conquest the Bible describes. So, here's the bottom line. A huge, large-scale exodus isn't supported by the evidence, but the memory of a smaller group's escape might be buried deep inside that story.
So after all that mystery from the early days, the fog of history finally starts to lift. The story enters a new phase with the creation of an actual kingdom, and it's right here that the historical and archaeological records finally start talking to each other.
Around 1030 BCE, the Hebrews get organized under a king, Saul, to fight off their enemies, the Philistines. After him comes the famous King David, who makes Jerusalem his capital. And then comes David's son, Solomon, who builds this magnificent temple there. This whole era is called the United Monarchy, a supposed golden age. But for a very long time, historians wondered, was King David even a real guy or just a legend?
And then, in the 1990s, archaeologists found this. Just a fragment of a stone monument, an inscription carved by an enemy king bragging about his victories. And on that stone were these three words, House of David.
This little rock fragment, known as the Tel Dan stele, was an absolute game-changer. Dating to the 9th century BCE, it's the first and only piece of evidence from outside the Bible that directly mentions King David. Now let's be clear, it doesn't prove the whole story of David and Goliath,
But what it does confirm is that a real royal dynasty, known as the House of David, was a major political player in the region. This was a massive, massive discovery.
After Solomon's reign, the story actually gets even clearer in the historical record. But that golden age? Well, it doesn't last. The kingdom splits apart, kicking off a period of rivalry, foreign invasion, and ultimately, total defeat.
So the United Monarchy cracks right in two. In the north, you get the bigger, wealthier Kingdom of Israel. And down in the south, you have the Kingdom of Judah, which held on to Jerusalem and the dynasty of David. For the next couple hundred years, these two Hebrew kingdoms existed side by side. But they were living in a really tough neighborhood, right in the shadow of these massive, growing empires. First, the mighty Neo-Assyrians came storming in. In 722 BCE, they wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel and deported a huge chunk of its population. Then came the Babylonians, and in 586 BCE, they did the unthinkable. They conquered Judah, they destroyed Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, and they marched the elite off to exile in Babylon. And these aren't just Bible stories. These events are all over Assyrian and Babylonian records. Now, a catastrophe like that could have been the end of the story for the Hebrew people, but instead, it sparked their single most important and lasting contribution to world history, a powerful, totally revolutionary new way of thinking about God. We often think of Hebrew monotheism as starting way back with Moses, and sure, the first commandment seems pretty straightforward, but let's look at the language really closely. You shall have no other gods before me. See, that phrase doesn't say other gods don't exist, it just says you're not allowed to worship them. This hints that this whole idea developed over time. Early on, the Hebrews were probably part of a wider Canaanite culture that worshipped lots of gods, like El, the storm god Baal, and even a goddess named Asherah, who some saw as Yahweh's wife. And archaeology backs this up. We find little figurines of these gods all over the place. The idea that only one God exists in the entire universe, that took a very long time to develop. And the catalyst, the thing that really cemented it, was the trauma of that Babylonian exile. Faced with total national collapse, the exiled Judeans doubled down on what made them unique. They came to a radical conclusion. Their God wasn't just some local god who had been defeated. No, he was the one true God of the entire universe, who was using the Babylonians to punish his own people for not being faithful. It was in exile that their monotheism was truly forged into what it is today.
And this brings us all the way back to our central question. The historical story of the ancient Hebrews is this complex mix of things we can verify, legends we can't, and this profound cultural evolution. It shows us how a small group of people, through all their triumphs and disasters, developed an idea that would literally change the world. Which leaves us with one last thought. When a story has this much power, does its real significance lie in the exact historical facts or in the enduring cultural and moral truths that it created for all of humanity?